the spiritual leader of the people at that time, Devorah.
So we've had a prophetess?
Yes. I mean, there have been many prophetesses.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. But this was, Devorah was a very famous one, is that she was a judge, more than just a prophet. She was a judge. She was like Joshua. She was like a judge of Israel. She was the Gadol Hador. She was the leader. She was the rabbi of the generation, and people came to her for guidance and Torah. In any case, this book is kind of using some of the Kabbalistic principles and teachings in order to kind of guide and elevate our daily living. So I think it's kind of a unique fusion of two different approaches to Torah learning, the one the mystical, the other the ethical, in one text. So that being said, we'll just try and quickly recap some of the things we discussed yesterday, although there was quite a lot there and quite a lot of depth, so I don't want to go into it at this point in too much detail. But the major idea is that the way in which we're to live our lives is to emulate God, and we don't know anything about God's essence, but we can extrapolate things about God from the way God interacts with creation. So the book is basically predicated on the idea of using Torah teachings which give us deeper insights into the way God interacts with creation as a menu, a path to emulate those attributes of God in order to cleave to God, in order to live a more holy lifestyle. And some of the things that we discussed are preliminary information that you need to know to understand what the book is getting at. And that's a lot of what we spent time yesterday. And just to quickly review, the basic position of Jewish mystical thought, that's Kabbalah, is that if we were to ask, can God do anything God wants? The answer to that is no. There are things which God, quote unquote, can't do. Like God cannot cease to exist.
God can't create a rock that he can't lift.
Right, we discussed that as an example yesterday, as a basis for this discussion, right? A more sophisticated version of that question would be, can God will himself or itself out of existence? The answer is no, but not because God is limited, but because God is so great that God can simply not exist. Therefore, it's an inherent impossibility, because of God's greatness, that God not exist. And therefore, in the same, following that line of logic further, God should really not be able to, and in fact, God does not create, because there can be nothing other than God. Infinity plus anything finite is, by definition, infinite. So that anything that's created as physical and finite would, by definition, be imploded back within the infinity of God and therefore be existentless. God creates in a way which is really a facade of something physical and finite, being something separate from God, where in truth, anything that we perceive to be existence is really just a part of the continuum of God's infinity.
Including ourselves.
Yeah, everything that we perceive to exist, even consciousness, is all part of the infinity of God. And we didn't discuss this yesterday, but you might think about the analogy of a line in, let's say, on one plane in two directions represents infinity. But that line which represents infinity is still comprised of finite segments, an infinite number of finite segments, yet there is a finite spectrum within that degree of infinity. And therefore, a segment is simultaneously finite and part of the infinite. And that would be perhaps a type of a model to discuss, or to give an example of what we're talking about. That from the Kabbalistic point of view, there really truly is absolutely nothing other than God. And anything that seems otherwise is just a different manifestation of that infinity. It's just of a segment which is absolved really into dissolved in separate part of the infinite line of which it's a part. So how does that take place then? This kind of facade of creation is described by Kabbalah as taking place by God's doing what's referred to as tzimtzum. Tzimtzum is retracting or recoiling or withdrawing or limiting. It's hard to find the exact word. It probably means all of those and more. But the point is that God did all of that to itself in order to create at least the possibility of there being a perception that something exists other than God. And God's withdrawing the absolute intensity of its infinity, which we call tzimtzum, is resulted in a place which is described as being a vacated space. There was no space beforehand, and there's no space afterwards per se, but it's vacated of the intensity of the absolute infinity of God. And that allows for the possibility of creation, a void, a place which is void of that absolute intensity of the presence of God, which would sear all of existence, anything that would come into being out of existence. That's withdrawn. And that empty space, that's called the vacated space, that's called a halal panui, the vacated space. And then God directed part of that divine energy into that vacated space in order to generate creation. And that becomes the universe. Okay? Now, we describe that in terms of the relationship to the name of God, Yud and Hey and Vav and Hey, where that name, Yud, Hey, and Vav and Hey, describes not the essence of God, but the closest that we could get to understanding the essence of God, as opposed to the name of Elokim, right, which is a different name. And these two different names imply two different things. Yud Ke Vav Ke describes God as creator. Elokim describes God as ruler or sovereign over the creation. We are to emulate God as ruler over creation, having been created B'Tselem Elokim, in the image of not Yud Ke Vav Ke, which is creator, but rather in the image of Elokim, which is ruler and master. We were given, therefore, the potential of mastery over creation, similar to the way in which God has sovereignty and rule over creation. And it's connecting to those attributes of God that we can exercise that sovereignty positively. Okay? But the point about this withdrawing of the energy and then directing it back into the space of creation in a limited way, this is a type of spiritual refraction which reduces the intensity of that divine energy in order for that energy on the one hand to be used to create without destroying creation. And that kind of, the reduction of the intensity of that energy, which we describe with the analogy of a power plant, which is generating huge amount of energy. If you would put your household appliance, like a little nightlight, into the source of that nuclear reactor, the energy would actually not only ignite the bulb, but sear the whole bulb out, sear it out of existence. That energy has to be reduced through a series of reduction stations until it can be used productively in your home. So too, divine energy is reduced stage after stage, stage after stage, so that energy can be, on the one hand, used to do something productive without destroying what it's produced. The reduction of that energy takes place through a series of, let's say, spiritual filters, which Jewish mysticism refers to as Sephirot. The Spheros. We discussed this yesterday, right? Did we name the Spheros? Did we just? So there are 10 of these Spheros. Did we name and describe the details? I don't remember.
You just named them at the end of the class.
That's where we got at the very end, right?
Yeah. And you explained that the Malchut is connected to the Keter.
Yes.
At the same level.
Right, very good. So I think towards the end of the class, I just kind of mentioned the names, saying that perhaps we'd go in more detail.
Can I just ask, yesterday you talked about Yud K, Vav K, like what each of the letters symbolize.
Mm-hmm.
What about Elohim?
So the name Elohim, I think what I mentioned there is that it's related to the word El, where El means force. And remember, we described there how Elohim is referring to not a plurality of forces, as some suggest, but rather that God is the power over all forces. But we did not discuss, and I don't remember seeing the idea, the name Elokim being kind of described in the type of visual detail that we discussed regarding the Yud and the Hey and the Vav and the Hey. But there's a lot of depth there in the letters of that name of God and what those letters represent and their order and their shape, which we discussed yesterday, which I didn't review today. We'll leave that for what was done yesterday. Yeah.
Going back to the divine power dampeners, kind of. Could an analogy used for that be the kind of like how a woman holds like a child in her, and like goes? Would that be a good analogy, or?
Yeah, I think a very good analogy, and we discussed that yesterday as well. That the Yud and the Hey and the Vav and the Hey direct energy that comes from the neshama in the brain, which the Jewish sources describe as the source for the life-giving fluid, the masculine life-giving fluid, traveling down through the central column of the body and released between the central, through the center of the body below. And we discussed how this is the Yud, and this is the Hey, and this is the Vav, and this is the Hey. And that energy is directed down from the highest place in the head, which corresponds to the letter Yud and Atzilus. That divine energy is actually emitted into that space, where that space then gestates the energy and uses it to build the details of the universe.
But isn't it more proper to use a chet instead of a hey? Because it's connected.
Yeah. You could say that. You could say that. But it's viewed as being as still like the three-sided hay. You have two arms, and then you have the middle section. I mean, your body part is connected. It's true.
Is there something special to the side that's not connected, or would it say that hand or that leg is weaker in a way?
It's an interesting point. Never really thought about that. Maybe maybe there's a little break on the left-hand side, corresponding to the Devorah. I'm not quite sure. That's something to think about.
This sounds an awful lot like chakras in India.
Yeah, it's there might be some correlation. Either these are things Judaism receives through tradition, but it might be things that people can empirically find through exploring their own energies, and you'll find some overlap. And we'll go into more detail about that shortly. But yesterday we were talking also about the analogy of the Yud and the Hey and the Vav and the Hey, where the Yud is Ein Sof. That's the area in which the vacated space became available. So anywhere outside of that would be the Yud. The boundary of that vacated space would be the Hey. The Kav, the line that goes into that vacated space, that would correspond to the Vav, the conduit or the channel through which the divine energy is directed from the Ein Sof Yud through the boundary, which is the Hey, down into that lower vacated space, which is Hey, the arena for creation. And we spoke therefore about how the energy coming from Hashem through Ein Sof into the world of Bria, and then through Yetzirah, and then into the world of Asiyah, would be like energy which is emitted into that space, received by that space, gestated by that space, and then used to create. So I just made reference to 4 spiritual worlds, which we talked about in detail yesterday, but I didn't want to go into too much in detail today. But those are those 4 worlds: Atzilus, Bria, Yetzirah, and Asiyah. Atzilus being the highest, closest to the emanation, the source of divine energy that's emanated from the Creator into the creation. That's Atzilus. Then Bria is the potential for creation, even though Bria means creation. In this way of thinking, we're not talking about the actual tangible creation. We're talking about the blueprint for creation, which in many ways we described yesterday is really the more creative step than the actual formation of the physical objects. Because the ideal or the concept is bringing out something new from something that was not there beforehand. That's the yesh mi'ayin. Once you have the concept, executing that concept is really just a matter of fabricating and bringing together the parts. So even though we call the coming together parts creation, what we're just exploring here is the idea that that's not really creation, that's formulation. The creation is the bringing into being, the bringing into existence the potential for creation. The Vav is what extends that potential into the real. And the final, that's the world of Asiya, that's the world of assembling. Right? That's the world that we call the world of creation, but it's really the physical manifestation of the creation, which is in the higher world of Bria. Okay? So you have, what's that?
3 worlds.
There are 4. So there's Atzilus, Bria, Yetzira, and Asiya,
So you're
corresponding to Yud and He and Vav and He. What?
So are you saying that God had to conceptualize before he created the world?
It's not
Because it
that.
would seem that he wouldn't. That process wouldn't even take place. He would just do it.
Yes, I mean we're breaking it down into kind of segments or parts. When in truth, in terms of the continuum of God, it's really all one, and it's instantaneous, and it's not something which is subject to time. But another important point we mentioned yesterday is that if we're used to thinking about creation in terms of on day 1, God proactively did act A, B, and C. On day 2, God proactively did act D, E, and F, and so forth and so on. According to Kabbalistic thinking, that's actually not true. What happened is exactly the converse. On day 1, God retracted step A, B, and C, so that the corresponding A, B, and C could come into fruition in creation. And on day 2, God made 3 another step back. So Tzimtzum, in other words, creation is really it doesn't result from a proactive act of creation. It actually results indirectly from Tzimtzum, from God's retracting, withdrawing. So as God withdraws, that enables something other than God, as it were, to seem to come into existence. And as God withdraws to a further extent, then more comes into
So
existence.
he's like a sculptor removing the marble and
Excellent.
comes out
Yeah.
as the sculpture.
Very nice. That's a really nice way of putting it. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Very nice. Very nice. I mean, another analogy that maybe comes to mind is that if you wanted to construct a dam in order to harness the latent power in that flow of water, you would have to kind of stop that flow in order for you to create a place or a space or potential where you could construct that kind of dam. And the more you hold that water back, the more you'll be able to construct. Where the ultimate purpose is to let that flow go again through the dam, but in this way, in a directed, concentrated way, in order to harness the power. And that's another maybe analogy that comes to mind. God is kind of retracting in order to bring everything to enable the construction of things that seem to be in existence separate from God. And then God allows his flow to come through that apparatus in a direct, concentrated type of a way in order for the potential energy to be utilized and harnessed constructively. In that respect, that's really what Shabbos is. Maybe this gives us a different understanding of what Shabbos is as well. We're used to thinking about Shabbos as a way of commemorating God's refraining from creation, as if God exerted some effort to create and God had to resist or desist or rest from creation, when in fact that's really not what happened. It's exactly the opposite. If there was any exertion on God's behalf in creation, it wasn't proactive. It was from desisting, from being, holding himself back. So Shabbos is really about, as it were, God's letting himself go again, reintroducing or enabling his presence to be infused in the degree that's potential to maintain creation into creation during Shabbos. So Shabbos is really not God's resting from creation, it's God letting itself back into the creation that came into being.
So
In a way, it's kind of like returning to, on a smaller scale, the plane of existence before creation, because creation started on what, quote unquote, day of the week? Day one. Day one, which was what? Let's say Sunday, right? So what was before that? What day was before the day of creation? Shabbos. It was some type of, primordial, universal, absolutely perfect and infinite state of divine being in existence, and that corresponds to Shabbos. So once God, once creation comes into being, stage by stage, day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, as a result of God's retracting further and further back, then Shabbos is about God's reintroducing that initial state of Shabbos back into creation, kind of closing the circuit. And therefore, when we're celebrating Shabbos, it's not so much about celebrating or recognizing God's resting from creation, but about God's reintroducing His presence into creation. That's really what we're celebrating. Yeah.
I thought God creates like in every instant.
What do we mean by that? What we mean by that is that this divine energy, which is really and energizing creation, is flowing through reality, keeping it in presence, keeping it as it is. But in a way, again, that creation that God is doing constantly is not proactive. It's God's holding back the intensity of His infinity so that a creation shouldn't implode back into it. But there's nevertheless this restricted degree of divine presence, which is in the oilam, keeping it together.
Through the sphere.
Well, part of the way it happens is through the sphere. Sphere is part of it. But by the way, this is this is at the root of why in Hebrew we call existence oilam. Oilam means literally, Reb Mordechai.
Concealment.
Yeah, oilam means concealment. So figure that one out. Right, physical finite existence is referred to in Hebrew as concealment. You have nothing more revealed than existence. Why is it called concealment? The point is, it's an existence that comes into place through the process that we're describing, the concealment of the absolute infinity of God. Because if the absolute infinity of God were revealed in that place, then creation would cease to exist. So creation, or at least our perception of creation, comes about through God's hiding itself, thereby enabling creation, existence, to seem to come into being as something separate than God. But God's presence there is only concealed. It's not that it's absent altogether, because if it weren't there, then of course, then there wouldn't be any creation either. So this is the idea of God's withdrawing to a degree where the divine energy can energize and generate and maintain creation without destroying it. And it's always there. And the fact that it's always there, flowing through this particular spectrum of God's existence, that's what we're referring to. That flow is what we're referring to as God's continually creating. Yeah.
So you're saying that God is constantly concealing Himself from the physical creation of everything, but when if He shows Himself and like existence ceased to exist, well then how is Moshe, quote unquote, seeing Him on Mount Sinai?
So, for example, I mean, in the Torah, Moshe asked God, Harini Esdarkecha, show me your ways. And God's response to that is, Lo Yirani Adam V'chai. A person can't see me and live. Meaning, a person can't see me, can't see the revealed aspect of my presence while alive, only after death. So that means that a person can only, that whatever a person can see, and Moshe did see a greater degree than others, but whatever a person can see is going to be limited, and a person is only going to truly be able to see, right, once the person's, let's say, outside of the physical plane and back into that kind of metaphysical plane. But that being said, to the extent to which a person can see, and let's say Moshe saw more than others, the result of that is the reason why Moshe was aglow. And so much so that people, as the Torah says, could not gaze upon him. His aura was so brilliant that people were blinded by the light that was shining through him because of the divine presence.
Not even Aharon?
Not even Aaron. He had to cover his face. He had to cover his face, which might be understood literally, or maybe he himself had to do a little bit of a cover-up job, like Hashem has to do a cover-up job for us to be able to see. So, again, all of this is inverted because we're used to thinking that we see as a result of light, but in truth, we see because of darkness.
I get that.
Say that again?
I don't understand that.
Because blinded by the light. Another, we used to see, we see by light, but the truth is, if we're really gazing upon the light, we would be blinded by the brilliance of the light, so that the light itself would be a source of blindness and not a source of sight. It's the very darkness which enables us to see. It's just not entirely dark.
So the default setting of the universe is pure light, and then there's darkness, which kind of makes the light that we see selective. And so that's, okay, I see what you're saying.
Yeah, and that's part of this filter. In other words, that's creation. Creation taking place through God's withdrawing or retracting, hiding that light. The result is a dimming of that brilliance, a certain occlusion of that brilliance, and that takes place through a series of what I was referring to earlier, spiritual filters. And these filters kind of minimize or limit the intensity of that light while simultaneously projecting it onto the screen of creation. And we therefore see darkened light. And that gives us our perception of reality. Another analogy that you can use to think about this, I don't think we mentioned this yesterday, is a movie. Did we discuss?
What?
It's like a movie. If you think about a movie is an intensely brilliant source of light that's projected through an occluding filter, that's the film, with different colors. And then that occlusion, on the one hand, filters, but also projects that light in different form onto what would otherwise be itself just pure light. And the observer views that, perceives that projection of light as reality. So that if you're drawn into, for example, the images that are being projected on to that space, you actually can be drawn into that as your reality. And think about it like a movie. Somebody might throw a punch, right? If you're really into the movie, you might go like this. Yeah, or some passionate love scene is taking place on the screen. Your heart starts beating. Yeah. You're like living out that drama. It becomes your reality. And that's what we're doing. Right? We're interacting with each other in ways where we might go like this, or our hearts might palpitate. Maybe because we're living out a drama of the human experience, but really it's just a manifestation of the projection of divine light through these filters onto a place which is really God. But it's presented to us in a way as if it's a separate reality, with a lowercase r. These filters, or the filtering process, takes place in part through what we call sefirot in Jewish teachings, or the Ashkenazi pronunciation is spheros. Okay, spheros. There are different reasons why they're called that. Different reasons why they're called that. Should I discuss that? I suppose there's just so much to discuss. But these spheros are like these spiritual filters, which are reducing the divine light. And they are projecting divine energy onto the space of creation. And they're kind of like going through a spiritual prism, which refracts intense white light at the source into its component parts, the different colors of the spectrum. In a way, that's what those spheros are. And that's what we started to discuss, I think, at the end of the class yesterday, is the fact that this divine light goes down or out. We're not really talking about space, but insofar as that describes what we're talking about, there's a source of light or energy that comes from God. It goes through an initial prism, sphera, which is referred to as the Sphere of Kesser. Kesser means crown. Okay? Crown. Just like a crown encircles the king's head. It's studded with scintillating gems. So to the light comes through God's crown, as it were, containing within it kind of different types of gems, which scintillate that light and refract it into different places into the lower spheros. And those other spheros are Chokhmah and Bina and Das. Chokhmah to the right, Bina to the left, Das in the middle. There's right, left, and center. Generally, the spheres to the right are viewed as being masculine. Those to the left are viewed as being feminine. And those in the middle are a fusion between the two. So Chokhmah, Bina, and Das. Chokhmah is generally just understood to be referring to intelligence. Did we discuss this yesterday? No. We didn't define the spheres, did we? So, and I'm going to avoid doing that again today for the same reason I did yesterday, because the book is divided into two parts. The first part is talking about attributes. The second part is talking about the spheros. So when we get to the spheros, we'll discuss it in more detail then. But there are these 10 spheros, and these 10 spheros, just to mention them, are, like I said, the all-inclusive Kesser. You've got Chokhmah, Bina, Das, intelligence, understanding, knowledge. That's the first triad. Underneath that, you've got what's called Chesed, Gvura, and Tiferes. Chesed, loving kindness. Gvura, strength. Tiferes is like splendor, referring to balance, harmony, unison. And then you've got Netzach, Hod, and Yesod. Netzach to the right, that refers to victory or something which is eternal, eternity. Hod is beauty. After Tiferes is Netzach to the right, Hod to the left, and Yesod in the middle. That's like the third triad. And then underneath Yesod, you've got Malchus. Malchus means kingship. What's happening here is that divine light is being refracted through Kesser, separated into these different filters, each one with its own properties, which I'm not going to go into details with right now. But they're ultimately refused into the lowest sphere of Malchus, where Malchus then passes it on to the next level down. Okay? So what's happening here is that this divine energy has been refracted into component parts and then reduced in that way, but reorganized and reunified and then passed on for the purpose of creation. I'm very oversimplifying the system very much, but that's the general principle. These spheros, which are projecting divine energy onto creation, are viewed as being part and parcel of creation, because they are projecting into being creation. And that's certainly true regarding the creation, the pinnacle of creation, which is mankind. And that's certainly true regarding the pinnacle of mankind, which is the soul. So that there is a pattern of the spheros in the soul, and the pattern of the spheros in the soul is then transmitted to the actual physiology of the human body. Yeah, so that these spheros are viewed as actually being in our body. And you mentioned before about the chakras, so that the cranium is considered to be like the Kesser, containing within it the Chokhmah and the Bina and the Das, right, left hemisphere of the brain and the brainal stem. Okay, the third being a fusion of the first two, directing those messages to the body. Chesed, right arm; Gvura, left arm. Chesed and Gvura, right and left. Tiferes, torso, the middle. Netzach and Hod, right and left leg. Yesod, the sexual organ, and the crown, the Malchus is the crown of that sexual organ. Directing that kind of sexual energy, which is like the creative divine energy, the way in which we were created in the image of Elohim, into the world. What he's talking about here now into the book is recognizing the imprint of the spheros, what they mean, what they're used for, within our spiritual makeup and within our physical makeup, in order to elevate our living. Okay? That's what he's talking about. Okay? So, to quickly summarize, we're talking about Ein Sof, which precludes anything else from coming into existence. Ein Sof, that's God's withdrawing itself in order to create in order to provide for the potential of creation. Redirecting a limited amount of its presence into that space of potential creation, which is filtered, mainly or in at least in a major way through the spheros, and those spheros therefore becoming like energy points through which the divine presence is projected onto creation, and one of the major places that comes into fruition is the human soul, and therefore the human body. Okay? So we can emulate God's rulership over creation by identifying and recognizing these spheros, which in many ways are like attributes, and using our understanding of these spheros in order to emulate God and therefore elevate the plane of living that we were created to participate in. Okay? Is that clear? All right. We can hopefully we can clarify it more as we go along as well. But all of that, we said. So that's a lot of what we discussed yesterday as we were reading the text. Now, having reviewed it, we can today I guess having discussed it before the text, we'll be able to understand the text more. So let's just start over again from the beginning because we only got one sentence far yesterday, right? So Perak HaRishon, Ha'adam Roi. Anybody need a copy? Ha'adam Roi Sheyidame Lakono. It is befitting that a person emulate his creator. I'm not going to elaborate. What we discussed hopefully will be apparent in the text.
This is Aramaic, right?
No, this is Hebrew. Huh?
Just a quick question
Yeah.
on this. That's also referring that a son should watch his father and learn how to do the things that his father does?
Yeah, you should identify the attributes and try and emulate what's worth emulating.
Okay.
Yeah. In the case of Hashem, everything's worth emulating. That's not always the case regarding the Father. Ha'adam roi sheyidame lekono. A person, it is befitting that he emulate his Creator, make himself like his Creator. And this is what I was referring to about having been created b'tselem Elokim. Va'az yiyeh besod hatzura helyona. And in this way, he can align himself with the supernal image. What he's referring to here is aligning oneself to these spheros that exist within our physical body and also our soul. And in this way, align ourselves to the apparatus of the spheros, which are in the metaphysical world, these filters through which the divine energy is directed for creation. Tselem udmus, with the image and with the form. She'ilu yedume begufo velo peulos, because if a person emulated, just by virtue of the fact that his physiology mirrors or has within it these spheros, but if it's only on the physical plane and not with a person's actions, hare hu machsi v'tzura, this is a way of dishonoring this system or this apparatus, this image of God in the metaphysical world. Why? Because God is clearly not physical. God is metaphysical. But the physical plane is supposed to mirror the spiritual plane, which was used for creation. If a person is using only the physical plane of existence and not bringing into harmony with the metaphysical plane of existence, so he's dishonoring the Creator. He's dishonoring the image in which he and the world were intended to be created. V'yomer olav, and they'll say about such a person, tzura no, he's got a beautiful physical form, umasim keurim, but the person's deeds are out of line, are out of whack. Why is this? He says, Shahari ikar hatzelem v'hadmus, the main form and image, ha'elyon, on high, hen pe'ulasav, though that is really God's actions. Right? Because God's essence is something which cannot be described. The act of creation is actually a manifestation of an attribute which is coming from God. So what we can really know about God is actually what's done. Those are the things that are done by God, the acts of creation and the attributes that were used in the process of creation. That, he says, that is the true form, that's the true image of God, not any physical form. Uma yoyelo, he also kitsur helyona, what will it help a person if his physical body in some way emulates the spiritual realm? Dumus tovni sevarav, according to the pattern, the organization of the limbs of his body. Upeulos lo yudame lakono, but his actions are not similar to that of God at all. So that if we were to give any image or form to God, which is really referring to this kind of apparatus of the spiritual realm that I described, the 4 worlds and the 10 spheros, the whole purpose of that is really to express the action of creation and not just the system itself. So what good is it going to be if a person has a body that mirrors that apparatus or that system, but the body is not doing anything productive which would emulate God's act of creation? Rather, the person's body is doing things which are destructive. That would be harmful. That would be a shame. That would be a great disgrace, right? If we were created in the image of God in this way, it was in order to be like partners with God in creation. But not to use that power to destruct, that would be very bad. And therefore he says, "Lefichach roi sheyidome el pulos kesser." It's befitting that a person bring his actions in line with the attributes of Kesser. That's the highest of the spheros. Shehen shalosh esrei midos shel rachamim elyonim. And there's included in this Kesser, this crown of the king, we're referring to as the 13 attributes of divine mercy. The 13 attributes of divine mercy, which are supreme on high. Uremuzois besod hapsukim. And these 13 attributes, they are intimated, suggested, hinted at in the following verse. I'm going to read the verse and then go back and try and explain something in a little more detail. Here's the verse. Mi kel kamoicha, who is like you, God, noise avon, who withstands or withstands transgression. V'over al pesha, you overlook sin. L'sheris nachalaso, to the remainder, the remnant of your portion. Lo hechsik la'ad apo, your anger will not be held forever. Ki chofetz chesed hu, because you are a God who desires kindness. The verse then continues, Yoshuv yirachamenu, you will, God, return to your mercy, yichvosh avnosenu, and you will cover up their transgressions, overlook and go within the strict judgment regarding their transgressions. V'sashlich b'mitzvos yam kol chatoisam, and you'll throw to the depths of the sea all of their sins. Titen emes Yaakov, give truth to Yaakov. Chesed la'Avram, give loving kindness to Avram. Asher nishbatu la'avoseinu, which you have sworn and made an oath to our forefathers. Mi me kedem, from time immemorial. So this is a long verse which is speaking in certain detail about the general attribute of divine mercy. Right? This book is going to be talking about, the first part of the book is going to be going into this verse, part by part, stage by stage, in order to break down the different expressions of divine mercy and the qualities and the attributes that we're supposed to be living according to. Okay, it's going to be based on this verse. But I guess we'll stop here today. We'll stop here today in order to continue with this tomorrow. I want to say a little bit more about the spheros before we go a bit further. But at this point, he's introducing what we call the 13 attributes of divine mercy, and it's those 13 attributes of divine mercy that he's going to be focusing upon in terms of our emulating God and elevating our living. Yeah.
Okay, so in the word condemn where you stopped at, there's 2 lines, like in the Gemara that we've been learning in the morning.
Oh yeah. No, that's just a quotation. That's literally quotations mark.
Oh, it's just a quotation.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. It's a verse that's being quoted, and it starts up around where the parentheses are. At the end of a line, there's the mi.
Yeah.
So a verse is being quoted from the word mi until kedem.
That's a long verse.
Yeah. Okay. I'm more happy to stay for questions, comments, clarifications. But if you want to take a break before the next class, then feel free to go.